The slap landed before Ezra even sat down. It cracked through the first-class cabin like a whip, open palm, full force, across the face of a 9-year-old black boy. The plane went still. Not a single tray rattled. Not a single voice dared interrupt. Ezra didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, small shoulders squared, eyes blinking but dry. The red mark on his cheek was already blooming. The flight attendant, whose name tag read C. Whitmore, stood over him, her hands still half raised, lips tight with irritation and something colder, something taut. "You don't belong here," she hissed through gritted teeth. "First class is for premium passengers." A few people shifted in their seats. An older white man across the aisle folded his newspaper with a smirk. No one said a word. And Ezra? He didn't say one either. He just reached into the small pocket of his navy blazer, pulled out a black e-reader, and without looking up, tapped it 3 times. Nothing flashy happened. No alarms. No gasps. But 10 minutes later, 3 major airlines would face the largest ethics-driven capital withdrawal in aviation history. And it all started with that slap. If you've ever seen something wrong and said nothing, tell us where you're watching from, because this story is for you. 3 rows back, a woman in a beige cardigan turned to her husband and whispered just loud enough, "See? That's the problem with this generation. They think manners don't apply to them." Ezra heard her. He also heard the sharp ding of the cabin service chime, the low hum of first-class murmurs that came after the impact, but before anyone decided to pretend it hadn't happened. The only person who actually moved was the younger flight attendant, Luis, who had been prepping drinks near the galley. His eyes widened when he saw Ezra, and for a moment, their gazes met. But Luis looked away. Ezra quietly stepped into seat 2A, as printed clearly on his boarding pass. He sat upright, smoothed his slacks, buckled his belt, and set the e-reader on his lap. The Sentinel icon in the bottom corner glowed faintly green, like a heartbeat. He tapped the screen once more. Ethic Force Protocol detected. Incident severity, Class 1, immediate bias event. Activate report? Yes. No. He pressed yes. The screen flashed once, then faded back to his book. He closed it, slid it into the pocket in front of him, and stared out the window. Ezra Thompson, age 9, wasn't like other kids his age. Not because he was special, but because he'd been prepared. Prepared by his grandmother, Violet Thompson, a name whispered with respect in boardrooms across aviation, transit, and ethics investing circles. Violet wasn't just Ezra's guardian. She was the founder of the Ethical Motion Fund, a $38 billion force that graded transportation companies on passenger treatment metrics and moved capital accordingly. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, Ezra just felt small, not because of the slap, but because no one stopped it, because silence had rushed in louder than any voice could have been. Earlier that morning, before his flight, Violet had walked him to the security gate herself. She wore a deep gray coat, long and elegant, and moved with the slow, intentional steps of a woman whose bones had earned every creak. She knelt beside him and adjusted his collar. "You are not here to fight," she said quietly. "You are here to witness, and when the moment comes, press the truth." Ezra didn't fully understand at the time. Now, in seat 2A, cheek still tingling, he understood better than he wanted to. 5 minutes later, the flight was in the air. No one offered Ezra a drink. No one asked if he was okay. Carrie Whitmore avoided his row entirely. He heard her chuckling with passengers behind him, saw her pour wine for a couple in 3C and 3D, joking about entitled kids these days. Ezra didn't react. He didn't need to. Across the country, in a quiet office suite on the 22nd floor of a glass tower in Chicago, a server pinged. Sentinel Protocol, activated flight ID, Skynova 160, passenger, Ezra Thompson, Outh, EMF Level 2. Trigger time, 0741 AM PST. Action, EMF watch list triggered. Within 90 seconds, 3 major investment dashboards blinked red. Sky Nova Airlines Aero Vista Corp Cloud Jet International. Each was listed on the EMF Ethics Index, which tracked behavioral risk in aviation using proprietary passenger data, complaint signals, and biometric bias detection. Ezra's report wasn't a complaint. It was a verification. His device had captured biometric anomalies in Carrie's voice, body language, and proximity patterns, all automatically logged. And Violet had taught him how to use it. Back in the air, Ezra leaned his head against the window. Clouds slid by like pale mountains. He didn't cry. He didn't fidget. He just waited. At minute 9, Carrie stopped laughing. Her supervisor had just messaged her via the in-flight system. "We're under EMF surveillance. What happened with seat 2A?" At minute 10, an alert hit the airline's internal dashboard. Alert. Ethic force activated. Immediate action required. Publicly disclose racial service distribution data within 24 hours. Comply or face removal from EMF Ethics Index. Notify risk management, PR, legal, and board representatives. Carrie didn't know what half of it meant, but her hands started to shake. She walked to the lavatory and closed the door behind her. Ezra? He hadn't moved. Back in Seattle, Violet Thompson sat beside the window in her sunroom, watching the birds. A soft buzz on her tablet caught her attention. She looked down, read the code notification, and gave a single nod. "Good boy," she whispered. "You listened." Have you ever seen someone wrong a child and no one said a word? Type 1 in the comments if you've ever witnessed a silent injustice. And stay with us. Ezra's silence is about to shake the entire aviation industry. Ezra hadn't spoken a word since takeoff, while the rest of the first-class cabin buzzed with shallow conversations. Wine, weather, corporate banter. He sat still in seat 2A, legs uncrossed, spine straight, eyes steady. The stinging on his cheek had faded, but the weight of silence, that hadn't. Luis, the junior flight attendant, passed his row again. Ezra didn't look up, but Luis stopped. He bent down, voice low. "I saw what she did. I didn't know what to say." Ezra glanced at him, just for a second. "You didn't have to say anything," he replied. "It's already been recorded." Luis blinked. "Recorded?" Ezra didn't explain. He didn't have to. Instead, he pulled out his e-reader again and tapped the corner. A second prompt flashed. "Sentinel protocol active. Confirmed incident log. Skynova 160. Monitoring in progress." Luis didn't understand what he was looking at, but something about that green pulsing icon made his gut twist. And Ezra's face, calm, unreadable, reminded him of someone who wasn't just sitting quietly. He was waiting. Ezra had learned long ago that speaking up wasn't always the most powerful move. Sometimes, silence let the truth land heavier. That wasn't a lesson he'd learned from books. It was one taught, gently but firmly, by the woman who'd raised him. 3 months earlier. Seattle, Washington. A quiet Tuesday morning. The old house on Fremont Avenue stood 2 blocks from Lake Union, tucked behind a row of plum trees and tall iron gates. It wasn't grand, but it had character. Aged wood, sprawling front porch, windows that looked like they'd seen 100 years of rain and change. Ezra sat on the floor of the study, back against a velvet armchair, listening to the soft click of his grandmother's cane as she moved about. "Read it again," Violet said from behind him. Ezra cleared his throat and continued. "Power is not always about raising your voice. Sometimes it's about knowing when to press a button instead." She chuckled. "That one's mine." "I know," Ezra said, smiling. She lowered herself into the chair behind him and smoothed her skirt. "People think activism is noise, but noise fades. Systems don't." Ezra turned toward her. "But what if someone hurts you? Isn't saying something better?" Violet nodded slowly. "Yes, when the space is safe for truth. But in rooms where truth is punished, we build tools, quiet ones, clean ones, that make the system trip over itself. She tapped the side of his e-reader. That's what this is, a tripwire. Ezra held the device tighter. So, if someone hurts me, and I can't say anything, you press it, Violet finished. Not out of revenge, but to remind them. Your silence is a warning, not surrender. She hadn't always walked with a cane. 15 years earlier, Violet Thompson had stood in front of the World Transport Ethics Summit, and delivered a speech that forced half the global airlines into transparency reforms. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had simply read aloud 10 incidents of racial discrimination in first-class cabins, followed by 10 corporate audit reports EMF had acquired, silently connecting dots no one wanted to see. By the time she finished, 4 CEOs had left the room. 1 fainted, and an entire industry rewrote its ethics charter within a year. Ezra had heard the stories his whole life, but he didn't realize until that flight to Chicago that he was now the tripwire. Back in the sky, Ezra looked around the cabin again. Carrie Whitmore hadn't come near his row since the slap. Her voice still floated down the aisle, pleasant and performative, but the cracks were forming. Passengers were getting restless. Luis offered Ezra a bottle of water. This time, he accepted. In Chicago, the Ethical Motion Fund's legal team had already received Ezra's verification log. They didn't question it. When the name Ezra Thompson appeared on the dashboard, they moved. A secure call was made to FAA's Office of Transport Bias Oversight. A private alert sent to the Department of Transportation's Ethics Compliance Division. EMF's Global Partner Fund, Farrow Equity, which held $1.1 billion in aviation tech infrastructure, froze all pending credit renewals for SkyNova, AeroVista, and CloudJet. All 3 were now under forced review for ethics non-compliance. Meanwhile, back on Flight 160, a woman in row 1C leaned over toward Ezra. She looked to be in her 60s, pearl earrings, tightly curled silver hair. I saw it happen, she said quietly. You were very brave. Ezra didn't respond right away. Thank you, he said at last. She looked like she wanted to say more, but something about the boy's stillness stopped her. She'd seen children cry before. She'd never seen one sit like this, collected, observant, and already moving the world around him without making a sound. Back at EMF, Violet Thompson's personal email lit up. She was already waiting. She opened the report. 1 glance, 1 exhale. No panic. She forwarded it to 3 senior advisors with 1 line. Do not call the airline yet. Let the protocol speak first. She knew this would trigger an automated 24-hour demand for disclosure of racial service patterns on flights, something SkyNova had been dodging for years. She also knew that refusing would mean complete blacklisting from EMF's ethics index. Once off that list, no public investment partner, US or abroad, could legally finance them under new disclosure laws. And all that, because a boy pressed a button. Carrie Whitmore's phone buzzed in the crew galley. The message was from operations. You've been flagged in a Class 1 incident, pending ethics review. Do not engage passenger in 2A. Management will follow up post-landing. Her hands started to sweat. She remembered the slap. She remembered how easily it had come, how natural it felt, because no one had ever made her answer for it before. Now, her entire job was hanging in the air. Ezra felt it too. Not guilt, not fear, just the quiet tension of a system finally being forced to look at itself. He took out a small notebook from his backpack. It had a black leather cover and a gold-embossed quote from his grandmother on the front. When the world ignores your voice, let them hear your impact. He opened to a blank page and started writing. By the time Flight 160 began its descent into O'Hare, the tremors had already hit the ground. At SkyNova Airlines headquarters, a 6-story glass fortress just outside Denver, the executive floor was in chaos. What had started as a single alert from the Ethics Motion Fund at 8:12 a.m. was now spreading like a virus. Emails unanswered, emergency Zoom calls ringing, and the PR team locked in a war room with nothing but bad options. One passenger, one slap, one report. That's all it took. And now the entire Passenger Equity Evaluation System, PEES, the industry's post-pandemic measure for ethical flight practices, was glowing red next to their airline's name. Worse, the EMF compliance portal had just issued a global bulletin. Ethics Watch Alert. Sky Nova Airlines. Non-compliance. Service disparity by race in first-class cabin action required. Full transparency report on disaggregated passenger experience data deadline. 24 hours. Failure to comply will trigger index removal plus financial embargo from equity partners. That last line was what made the CEO, Brian Hensley, finally throw his coffee across the room. "It's a kid," he shouted to no one in particular. "A goddamn kid." But the woman seated across the table, Kira Devlin, Sky Nova's general counsel, had no sympathy in her stare. "It's not just the kid," she said. "It's the system. He didn't just file a complaint. He flagged us through Sentinel. That means biometric corroboration. It means they have data, Brian." "Then deny it." "We can't. You signed the ethics charter last year." Brian's face went pale, because she was right. In order to access EMF-aligned capital from North American and EU infrastructure funds, Sky Nova had agreed to binding arbitration for any Class 1 bias event, especially if logged through Sentinel, the platform backed by the Ethical Motion Fund. And Sentinel didn't just measure what happened, it measured how it happened. Voice tension, eye contact, posture, proximity bias, all automatically calibrated by the handheld reader the child had used. "He's only 9, Brian muttered. Kira leaned in. "Exactly. And he knew how to trigger an audit on us. That boy wasn't alone. Somebody trained him. Someone wanted this." Meanwhile, at O'Hare International Airport, Gate C-22, Ezra Thompson walked off the plane alone. No one from the crew said goodbye. No one from the airline staff offered help. But as soon as his foot touched the terminal floor, he saw her. Standing beneath a white skylight was his grandmother, Violet, in a dark gray coat and soft leather gloves. She smiled, not wide, not for show, just enough to say, "You did it. I'm here." Ezra walked into her arms and rested his head against her shoulder for just a second. "You pressed it?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. "She slapped me, right in front of everyone." Violet didn't stiffen. She didn't gasp. She just nodded once and said, "Then we wait." They didn't have to wait long. 35 minutes after wheels down, 3 of the largest transportation news outlets in the country received an embargoed statement from EMF's Ethics Council. A verified Class 1 incident has triggered full Sentinel review of Sky Nova Airlines and its peer partners. As per FAA's Oversight Charter 2022, we are requesting that all passenger behavior data, disaggregated by race, age, and cabin class, be made public within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in delisting from the EMF Ethics Index and revocation of compliance status for investor-grade funding. 1 hour later, CNN Business, Reuters, and The Guardian's aviation desk all published front-page headlines. Slapped, silent, and systemic. The 9-year-old who triggered a 1.1B flight ethics crisis. Sky Nova faces transparency ultimatum after Sentinel flag. FAA monitoring situation. Ethics tech activates after alleged first-class bias incident. Capitol watchdogs mobilized. Ezra's name wasn't in the headlines, but insiders knew. The industry had always whispered about Violet's boy, a rumored prodigy trained quietly behind closed doors, someone who could activate the protocols faster than any adult compliance officer. Now that rumor had a timestamp. Back at Sky Nova, legal emails exploded across international offices. Frankfurt asked if they should suspend code shares with Aerovista. Toronto threatened to freeze all training reimbursements. Singapore refused a gate-sharing proposal at Changi until Sky Nova cleared the EMF warning. Within 2 hours, 320 million in pending contracts were halted. At hour 3, Farrow Equity, EMF's capital partner, froze $800 million in forward credit lines tied to aircraft renewal deals across 3 continents. Then came the media calls. Kira Devlin stood by the window in the 5th floor conference room, watching clouds gather like bad omens over the Denver skyline. "What happens if we don't release the data?" the CFO asked. Kira didn't blink. "We get removed from the index. Once that happens, every EMF-aligned investor pulls out. And if that happens, FAA steps in. Our certifications go under review, and the other airlines tied to us through joint procurement, they go down too." "Because of one kid?" Kira turned around. "No," she said. "Because of one truth." Meanwhile, in a quieter room in the FAA's Office of Ethics and Equity, 2 officials reviewed the alert packet from EMF. "He used a verified Sentinel reader," the older official said. "And he logged it correctly," the younger one added. "Look at this. 3-second latency on facial impact capture. Voice strain from the attendant logged as over baseline threshold for intent. That's airtight." They both sat back. "We'll have to audit them," the senior official said. "Should we make it public?" "Let's give them the 24 hours, but prep the emergency flight access restrictions list." "You really think it'll go that far?" "I think," he said carefully, "we're not dealing with an accident. We're dealing with a designed response." Back in Chicago, Ezra and Violet sat in the back of a quiet cafe, tucked behind an ivy-covered brick building. He was sipping hot chocolate. She had chamomile tea. "Are you scared?" he asked. Violet looked at him. "No, Ezra. I'm not scared." "Then what are you?" She smiled gently. "Patient." Ezra leaned back, absorbing the word like a seed. "You did the right thing," she said. "Not by making a scene, but by recording what they thought no one would care about." He nodded slowly. "You didn't slap her back. You didn't yell. You didn't even cry. That's what made it land harder," she added. "Because now, they can't pretend you were the problem." Ezra turned to the window. Outside, a digital screen showed a live ticker of airline stocks. Skynova's line had just turned red. By sunrise the next day, the whispers had turned into headlines. Who is Ezra Thompson? That was the question splashed across every news outlet from CNN to the Washington Post. His name wasn't supposed to leak, but someone inside the ethics data pool had tipped off a reporter, and once that floodgate cracked, the internet did what it always does. Within 4 hours, someone found his 5th grade yearbook photo. 6 hours later, they found his grandmother's LinkedIn, and that's when everything shifted. Because Ezra Thompson wasn't just a black child in first class. He was the grandson of Violet Ellison Thompson, founder of the Sentinel ethics framework, the very system Skynova had triggered and underestimated. She'd trained Ezra since he was 4, and the device he'd used? A proprietary reader, not available to the public. It meant he hadn't just reported the slap. He had audited it. And the moment that connection hit airwaves, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. First, the EMF Ethics Index made good on its warning. At 10:04 a.m., Skynova, Ventralinks, and Aerovista were all removed from the EMF Index, pending full compliance investigation. The fallout was immediate. 1.1B in capital was frozen. 2 CEOs announced emergency leaves. 4 major airports suspended gate priority agreements. FAA called a 2 p.m. hearing to discuss industry-wide ethical certification revisions. And suddenly the story wasn't just about one airline. It was about an entire industry and how it had failed to evolve. Second, the public response turned. Where some had originally dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding, now people saw it for what it was. A pattern, finally proven by data. The slap wasn't just a moment. It was a match in a fuel tank of buried racism and double standards that had plagued elite travel for decades. And the one who lit it? A 9-year-old boy who never raised his voice. Third, Ezra's silence became his signal. He didn't hold a press conference. Didn't post on social media. Didn't cry on camera. He just stayed home with his grandmother, playing chess in their garden, while networks replayed the moment his file hit EMF servers. Ezra's not seeking fame, Violet told one journalist through a secure line. He's seeking fairness. And if a child has to start that process, what does it say about the adults who let it get this far? Inside Sky Nova HQ, the walls were practically sweating. Executives who had laughed 24 hours earlier were now whispering about resignations. Legal teams flagged dozens of past complaints that had never been properly logged. Kira Devlin, their lead counsel, stood by a projector in the boardroom, scanning through years of archived incident reports. "They're going to ask for everything," she warned. "Not just this flight. Every disparity, every ignored complaint, every first-class passenger report where race was a factor." Brian Hensley sat with his head in his hands. "What do we do?" Kira didn't blink. "You comply, or you collapse." Across the country, the FAA Ethics Board convened in an emergency session. 12 representatives, 6 screens, 3 cups of cold coffee, and one shared question. What happens next? "If we let this go, we signal that first class still has a color line," said board chairwoman Julia Nguyen. "If we move too fast, we trigger investor panic across the sector." "And if we do nothing?" someone asked. Silence. Then another board member added, "We're not talking about a viral video. We're talking about biometric truth. If Ezra's audit data stands, it means the system's broken, not the boy." Meanwhile, Ezra and Violet were walking through Millennium Park in Chicago, just before sunset. No cameras, no bodyguards. Just 2 people who knew exactly what they'd started. "Did I do it right?" Ezra asked. Violet looked at him gently. "You didn't flinch." "I wanted to. That's why it matters," she said. They sat on a bench facing the water. Behind them, giant digital screens continued looping headlines. 1.1B fallout after 9-year-old flags ethics breach. Sky Nova collapse triggers FAA policy overhaul. Later that evening, a new alert popped up in industry inboxes. From FAA Ethics Division, subject, Mandatory Compliance Summit, 72-hour notice, location, Washington, D.C. Details. All domestic airlines must present equity audit summaries, bias training protocols, and service class disaggregation data. Failure to attend will result in temporary certification suspension. Ezra didn't know that email had gone out, but he felt the ripple. It was in how Violet's phone kept buzzing, in how his mom, still abroad, sent him a voice message saying, "I've never been more proud of you," in how his former teacher from 2nd grade texted, "The world needed to see your silence. Thank you for not yelling." And far away, in a private suite atop a New York skyscraper, the CEO of EMF, Lorraine Bridges, stood by her window, watching planes cross the night sky. "Run the background check on Sky Nova's internal training archives," she said to her assistant. "And Ezra?" Her assistant hesitated. "What about him?" Lorraine turned slowly. "We're going to need him, not now, but when this burns through, he's the only one who can explain it to the next generation of regulators." As the night deepened, Ezra lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The slap still rang in his ears, but so did something else now. The sound of silence working, not through rage, not through revenge, but through recorded truth. Through a system his grandmother built, and through the decision he made to trust it. The invitation came in a white envelope with a golden seal. It didn't look like something a 9-year-old should receive. But then again, nothing about Ezra Thompson's life was normal anymore. Federal Aviation Ethics Oversight Board 72-hour Emergency Summit, Washington, D.C. Observer Credential, Ezra J. Thompson. Guest of Honor, Violet Ellison Thompson. "Do I have to speak?" Ezra asked, clutching the envelope. Violet shook her head, calm as ever. "You're not there to perform. You're there to witness. Let the people who ignored ethics squirm in their own silence." The summit was held inside the Wilton Federal Hall, 3 blocks from the Capitol. Security was tight. Press were corralled outside behind velvet ropes. Inside, executives from every major airline sat in stiff-backed chairs, holding binders and sweating through $1,000 suits. Ezra entered the room flanked by Violet and a silent staffer from EMF. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. At 9:03 a.m., the hearing began. The FAA opened with statistics. In 2024 alone, 63% of first-class service complaints involving black passengers were either unresolved or downgraded in severity. Only 12% of those complaints resulted in training intervention. 0% resulted in personnel termination. Until this week. The room shifted uncomfortably. Then the chairwoman turned. Before we proceed, we acknowledge the presence of a young observer, Mr. Ezra Thompson, whose ethical audit was the catalyst for this hearing. Mr. Thompson, we thank you. Ezra gave a small nod. One clap echoed, then a second. Then the room, reluctantly, applauded. That's when the message came. Violet's phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen. EMF liaison. Urgent. She stepped out of the room. Downstairs, in a side hall lined with marble columns, 3 men in suits were waiting for her. One introduced himself as Denton Locke, senior counsel for Aero Vista's lobbying division. Another, Martin Rhee, represented the National Transportation Syndicate. The third didn't give a name, just a card that said, Strategic Affairs Consultant, Private Sector. They weren't smiling. We have reason to believe the child is being manipulated, Denton said flatly. Violet didn't blink. Martin leaned in. He's a minor. This much press attention, it's not good for him. The third man added, We're not here to threaten. We're here to de-escalate. Let this summit end. Let him go home. Quietly. No more headlines. No more audits. Violet's voice was calm and cool. Is that your offer? Denton gave a tight smile. It's our solution. We'll issue a public apology, donate to EMF, maybe even fund a new ethics program in Ezra's name. She looked at them, amused. You don't want to fund ethics. You want to bury it. No one responded. Then Violet's tone shifted, just slightly. You know the mistake you made? She said softly. You thought silence meant permission, but some silences record, and some report. At that very moment, Ezra's device in his pocket vibrated twice, a silent signal. He glanced at Violet across the room. She nodded once. Back inside the hearing, the FAA chair began the next session. Service Class Bias Evaluation and Transparency Enforcement. It was dry. It was data-heavy. Most execs started zoning out. Except for Brian Hensley, Skynova's CEO. He wasn't watching the slides. He was watching Ezra, and sweating. Then something happened the execs weren't prepared for. The screens blinked. The room dimmed for a moment. Then a logo appeared. Sentinel Protocol, Live Feed Sync, activated. The chairwoman leaned into her mic. This next portion is brought to us courtesy of the EMF's real-time audit system, designed by Ms. Violet Ellison Thompson. She paused, then added, developed further by Ezra Thompson. Gasps, murmurs. One exec cursed under his breath. What followed wasn't a speech. It was evidence. A sequence of real passenger complaints scrolled across the screen. A black woman accused of sneaking into first class despite holding a valid ticket. A Latino teen denied water because he looked like he didn't belong. An elderly Asian couple forced to move for preferred passengers. All of them ignored. All of them logged into the Sentinel system. All of them verified for bias-coded language and response severity score. Then, the slap. Ezra's case. Full footage. Audio transcript. Cabin reaction. The room went still. One exec stood up, face red. This isn't regulation. This is surveillance. The chairwoman replied, No, this is accountability. Downstairs, Denton Locke's phone buzzed again. He read the message. then looked at Violet. "You flagged our conversation." Violet smiled gently. "I didn't have to. The boy did. You were too busy trying to silence him to realize he never stopped recording." Back in the hearing room, the final slide read, "Ethical Priority Index. Revised standards for certification. All carriers must adopt third-party bias audit tools. First-class service protocols must be disaggregated by race and age. Ethics compliance will determine FAA licensing eligibility. Deadline, 30 days. Consequence, suspension of flight operations in U.S. airspace." The room broke into chaos. Execs huddled. PR heads pulled out phones. Lobbyists began texting each other frantically. But Ezra? Ezra stood, turned to the chairwoman, and with a voice steady and clear for the first time all day, he said, "Thank you for listening. Most people don't." Then he walked out. That evening, as the sun dipped over the Potomac, Violet and Ezra sat on the hotel rooftop. "You didn't flinch," she said. "I wanted to. That's why it matters." They sat in silence for a moment, watching planes cut across the sky. Ezra broke it. "They tried to buy silence." Violet nodded. "And you gave them something louder." "What?" "A system they can't mute." It started with a single line of code, buried deep inside the check-in terminal software at Helix Air, a rising budget carrier known for cutting corners and dodging audits. Their tech chief had pitched it as a minor workaround. "We're not deleting the ethics checks," he said in a private board meeting. "Just delaying them. Just enough time to complete takeoff and landings before the system flags us." The room chuckled. The CEO, a man named Lyle Camden, leaned back in his chair. "If we can keep Sentinel asleep until the wheels hit the ground, it's not a violation, it's innovation." They all laughed. But Sentinel doesn't sleep, and Ezra Thompson doesn't miss. It was supposed to be a routine flight from Dallas to San Francisco. Helix Air Flight 307, mostly business travelers, and one high-profile guest, Ms. Nia Wallace, a civil rights attorney on her way to a keynote panel. Nia had booked first class, but when she scanned her boarding pass, something strange happened. The kiosk blinked, stuttered, then reprinted a new seat, 18B, economy. She double-checked. Same flight, same boarding time, different seat. "I'm sorry," the gate agent said. "There's been an upgrade reallocation." Nia raised an eyebrow. "To downgrade me?" The agent shrugged. "System error. It happens." But it wasn't an error. It was the line of code, and it was about to set off something much bigger than a seating mistake. Ezra was in Chicago that morning, back home with Violet. They'd just finished breakfast when his Sentinel interface blinked red. "Alert, Flight 307, Helix Air, anomaly detected, code 04B, race-based reallocation." Ezra tapped into the stream. The system had flagged a last-minute reassignment of a first-class black passenger to a middle economy seat. Replacement with a white executive who booked standby. No passenger incident or late check-in justification. Ezra didn't need more than 10 seconds. He reached for the interface. One tap. Sentinel override. Confirmed. Onboard Flight 307, things were already spiraling. Nia had calmly taken her reassigned seat, but passengers around her noticed the tension. "I saw her up front earlier," someone whispered. "Why'd they move her? Did she get caught doing something?" The murmurs weren't loud, but they were sharp, and Nia, seasoned as she was, could feel every one of them. She didn't argue. She just opened her iPad, pulled up the FAA ethics portal, and began writing. But the report would never be needed, because at 10:27 a.m., 38 minutes into the flight, something unprecedented happened. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker, slower than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed by air traffic control to divert. We are being rerouted to Denver International for an unscheduled landing." Confused murmurs erupted. What the hell's going on? Ezra knew. So did Violet. Back at EMF headquarters, an alert flashed across internal monitors. Auto enforcement engaged. Sentinel override. 1.6.3 violation. Intentional ethics audit suppression. Airspace. Response. Mandatory grounding protocol initiated. No manual input. No hearing, no press. Just data, verified and cross-referenced, activating real-time consequence. By the time Flight 307 touched down in Denver, FAA agents were waiting at the gate. The captain was escorted off the plane. The gate manager was suspended. Helix Air's entire ethics compliance division was placed under review, and by sunset, the biggest blow landed. Sentinel Ethics Index removed Helix Air from certified operations. Not pending, not under review, removed. No takeoffs, no bookings, no revenue. $400 million in overnight losses. That evening, Ezra sat with Violet on their porch swing. He didn't say much, just stared at the stars above, legs swinging lightly, hands tucked into his sweatshirt. Violet finally spoke. "You could have called them, warned them." Ezra looked over. "Would they have listened?" She shook her head. "Not to your voice, but maybe now they'll listen to your silence." Back in Washington, D.C., airline executives scrambled. The Sentinel system had gone from oversight tool to industry dominator. And worse, a child was its primary operator. Lyle Camden of Helix Air held a press conference the next morning. "We're investigating a technical malfunction. We support equity and inclusion." This was not intentional. The reporters weren't buying it. One asked, "So if it wasn't intentional, why did your system include a command labeled Delay Ethics Trigger?" Lyle froze. Another reporter followed up. "How does it feel to be outwitted by a 9-year-old with a conscience?" Silence. By week's end, 2 more airlines had voluntarily requested Sentinel audits. 3 more signed on to the Passenger Ethics Accord, a transparency pledge created after Ezra's testimony. And the FAA announced the formation of a Youth Oversight Committee, an advisory group that, yes, would include one name at the top, Ezra Thompson. But the boy himself? He remained quiet, never gave a press statement, never posted on social media. He just updated the Sentinel firmware, then got back to his school project on Black inventors in aviation history. When a journalist caught up with Violet outside her home and asked what Ezra thought of the chaos he'd caused, she smiled. "He didn't cause chaos," she said. "He caused consequences." The invitation came wrapped in velvet, sealed with gold foil, and hand-delivered by a man in a tailored suit who refused to give his last name. Ezra didn't open it. He handed it to Violet. She opened it for him. Inside was a single card with silver lettering. "We'd like to license Sentinel. Discretion guaranteed. Compensation negotiable. Archlight Capital Ventures, Global Technology Division." Violet flipped the card. On the back, a number. 8 digits. All zeros, but the first 2. "You know what this is?" she asked. Ezra nodded. "They want me to sell it." She paused. "They want to buy your silence." 2 days later, they flew to New York under the pretense of a strategic conversation. Ezra wore his favorite hoodie. Violet wore war paint, her signature lipstick, and the coldest heels in her closet. The meeting took place on the 87th floor of the Orion building, behind a glass table so wide it needed its own echo. The man who greeted them looked like he belonged on magazine covers, sleek, grinning, harmless, on the surface. "Ezra," he said warmly, kneeling down. "Big fan. You've done something the world hasn't seen before." Ezra said nothing. The man chuckled. "We're offering you full control. We just want to help you scale it. Globally. Efficiently." Then came the binder. Heavy. Lined with legal jargon. Violet flipped it open. Licensing rights. Exclusive patents. International waivers. Binding silence. One clause read, "All media rights transferred. Future versions require executive pre-approval." She looked up. "So you don't want the system. You want the power to decide who gets protected." The man shrugged. We want to ensure it's used responsibly." Ezra asked softly, "Whose definition of responsible?" Later that night, as they flew back home, Ezra sat by the window. Outside, the sky was black. Inside, Violet was silent, watching him think. Finally, he said, "Do you think it's stupid to say no?" She turned to him. "I think some people build empires just to protect their name. You built something to protect everyone else's." Then she added, "I also think they're too late." Ezra looked at her. She smiled. "I've already mirrored Sentinel. 3 months earlier, before the slap, before the hearing, before the FAA, Violet had anticipated this. She knew what happened to tools of justice once the wrong hands got close. So she had split Sentinel's architecture into 7 encrypted blocks, stored across 3 countries and 2 nonprofit networks. Ezra had access to 1 master key. She had the second. The others? Distributed through the Sky Ethics Coalition, a network of independent watchdog groups that had no idea they held the pieces. That same week, a leak hit the news. A whistleblower inside Archlight revealed documents showing the firm's plan to license Sentinel, strip it of auto enforcement, and repackage it as a consumer-facing data dashboard. No ethics, no flags, just pretty graphs. The public erupted. Hands-off Sentinel trended for 72 hours. When asked for comment, Ezra tweeted just one word: "No." Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly in the background. At 4:13 a.m. on a Thursday, Ezra logged into the Shadow Node deployment terminal, a hidden Sentinel mirror Violet had built. He uploaded an update. Sentinel EC version 2.0 launch, now mirrored to 3 continents, 5 ethics watchdog networks, offline audit capability, hard-coded transparency logs. No corporation may overwrite justice. Then he hit send. The reaction was immediate. By noon, 4 airlines issued statements declaring full compliance with Sentinel X. 2 transportation regulators abroad announced pilot programs. The EU Commission's Ethics Task Force formally requested partnership, and Archlight, they were roasted in hearings and shredded in the media. No one wanted to buy a censored version of justice. Later that week, a woman named Dr. Leona Hargreaves, Director of Global Aviation Policy, flew to Chicago just to speak to Ezra. She brought no cameras, no lawyers, just a notebook and tired eyes. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You didn't take the money," she said. Ezra shook his head. "You could have. I didn't build it for them." "Then who?" He looked at her. "For the next kid who doesn't get a second chance." She stood to leave, then turned. "Why you?" Ezra smiled a little. "Because they thought I was too small to see what they were doing." She nodded. "They won't make that mistake again." Violet walked her to the door. As it closed, she looked back at Ezra. He had returned to his desk, updating the next patch for Sentinel X. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he knew there would always be someone else who needed it next. It began with a whisper, not on social media, not in the press, but in boardrooms. Whispers that Sentinel was becoming too powerful, too fast, too ungovernable. So, a secret consortium of 5 global airlines and 3 private equity groups launched Project Skyclips, an encrypted shadow network meant to mirror flight data while silently suppressing ethics flags before they triggered enforcement. They called it optional oversight. They thought no one would notice. But Sentinel noticed. Ezra Thompson was at home, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, teaching his AI assistant how to identify fake apology statements. His screen pinged. Sentinel X protocol alert. Multiple flight ID ghost signals detected. Potential ethics flag suppression in progress. Ezra stared. The ghost signals were scattered across 5 airlines, 7 flights, all outbound, all scheduled for the next 20 minutes. He opened the encrypted dashboard Violet had built. All systems live, all synchronized, all quiet on the surface. But beneath the calm, the data pulsed unnaturally. Passenger reassignments without cause, crew comments redacted in logs, and worst of all, a child listed as non-viable occupant on a manifest. Ezra's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He whispered, "Not again," and he logged in. 08:32 a.m., LAX Tower. "Captain, Tower's just called. Your flight's been paused." The pilot blinked. Paused? What does that even mean? They said, and I quote, "A Sentinel audit has been initiated in Mid-Airspace Corridor 4B. The co-pilot looked up from her tablet. Is that even a real protocol? It was now. 08:34 a.m., Frankfurt Control Center. An entire gate was locked. Gate agents froze as boarding passes began to scan red for Flight 9052. A supervisor ran to the terminal, but before she could issue an override, her screen went black. One line appeared, "Audit in progress, please hold." The same message blinked in Tokyo, Cape Town, Miami, Toronto, and Dubai. 7 planes, 7 countries, 7 pauses. Back in Chicago, Ezra adjusted his headphones. He was reviewing a transcript from a crew member on Flight 721. You know what kind of kid that is. Probably flying on someone else's dime. The file had been manually deleted, but Sentinel doesn't forget, and Ezra had already restored the original. He flagged the crew ID, logged the tail number, marked the audit priority as immediate. He didn't shout, he didn't tweet, he just typed, and across the world, the skies listened. At FAA headquarters, the commissioner was already on his 4th cup of coffee when his comms officer burst in. "Sir, Sentinels locked 7 flights simultaneously. No clearance given. It bypassed standard override." "Who triggered it?" She swallowed. "Ezra Thompson." He didn't even blink. He just said, "Let it run." Media outlets caught wind within the hour. Screens buzzed with headlines. Sky locked down. 7 planes grounded in ethical audit led by 9-year-old. Sentinel boy halts flights across 5 continents. Justice at 30,000 feet. Public support exploded. Hashtags surged. But behind closed doors, the consortium panicked. Project Skyclips had been breached. Worse, it had been exposed without Ezra ever saying a word. By late afternoon, Violet received a message, encrypted, unsigned. It read, "You just cost us 1.2 in one morning. That child is dangerous. Pull him back, or we will." She showed it to Ezra. He read it, deleted it, then pushed one update to Sentinel. All shadow compliance systems now traceable. Attempt to mask Ezra's public disclosure. He turned to Violet. "Let them come. The sky belongs to everyone." By nightfall, FAA launched formal investigations into 3 airlines. 2 CEOs stepped down. Sentinel X downloads spiked 900%, and in an unprecedented move, the International Civil Aviation Organization issued a statement. Sentinel is no longer an experiment. It is now an ethical partner in global airspace. Ezra sat by his window again that night. He didn't look like a hacker. He didn't look like a regulator. Just a boy with a laptop, watching the planes pass overhead. He whispered, "Not one more child." For all the power Ezra held behind a screen, the world still hadn't heard his voice. Until that day. It started quietly. Violet received a personal invitation to attend the Global Aviation Ethics Summit in Geneva. But when she opened the formal packet, something caught her eye. It wasn't the gold seal or the embossed lettering. It was the speaker list. At the very top, Ezra Thompson, Rewriting the Sky, Ethics, Power, and a Child's Code. She looked at him across the kitchen table. "You ready?" Ezra paused, spoon hovering over a half-melted bowl of cereal. "No," she raised an eyebrow. "But I'll do it anyway." 3 weeks later, Geneva. The room wasn't just full. It was global. CEOs, aviation regulators, government ministers, former presidents, military generals, and Ezra, dressed in a navy blue blazer that barely fit his shoulders, standing behind a podium that towered over him. He cleared his throat once. The microphone screeched slightly. Then he spoke. "I didn't build Sentinel to punish anyone. I built it because I got tired of watching kids get hurt and no one being held accountable. I was one of those kids. The slap? That was just a spark. The system responded because the injustice was already everywhere. Some of you think this is a threat to control. I think it's a return to accountability. You can't license justice. You can't buy silence. And you shouldn't be allowed to run the skies if you don't care about the people in them. We're not trying to burn down your airlines. We're trying to make sure no one else gets burned for being born in the wrong seat." The room didn't clap immediately. There was silence. A heavy, raw silence. Then someone stood. A woman in uniform. Mid-50s. Medal on her chest. She saluted. Others followed. One by one, the entire hall stood up for a 9-year-old boy who didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't beg. He just told the truth. What came next was even more unexpected. A coalition of airline CEOs met in a closed-door session after the summit. By morning, news broke. 9 airlines signed unified ethics charter based on Sentinel protocol. The charter included mandatory ethics training for all flight crews, Sentinel-based passenger behavior review logs, whistleblower protections, annual transparency reports open to public audit. And in bold, at the top of the charter, "This sky belongs to all of us. Discrimination has no altitude." Meanwhile, the CEO of Skynova, the airline where it all started, resigned publicly on live broadcast. Her voice cracked mid-sentence. "We failed. We failed a boy. We failed our passengers. We lost our compass." She took off her badge, handed it to the board chair, and walked out. Ezra didn't celebrate. He didn't post anything. He didn't go on talk shows. He went home and opened his laptop. There were 2,431 new submissions to Sentinel from people all over the world. Flight attendants, airport janitors, mechanics, retired pilots, children. One said, "They told my mom to step aside for a white woman. She cried in the terminal bathroom. I recorded it. Uploading here. I want to help." Another said, "I thought it was normal to be treated like trash because of how I looked. Your system showed me it's not." Ezra read every one. Then he whispered, "Okay," and went to work. In Washington, D.C., something else was happening. The FAA met with a bipartisan committee to review aviation regulation. What started as a policy update turned into a landmark legislation push. The Passenger Justice Act. Key provisions. Every airline operating in U.S. airspace must implement an ethical compliance framework. Any passenger-related incident flagged by Sentinel triggers an automatic federal review. Failure to comply leads to immediate license suspension. One senator called it the most important civil rights advancement in commercial travel since desegregation. And the face behind it? A quiet boy from Chicago who never asked for fame, just fairness. 1 week later, Ezra received a package, no return address. Inside, a pilot's wings, real ones, gold-plated. A note tucked behind it read, "I used to think my job was to fly the plane. Now I know my job is to fly it right. Thank you for reminding me." He pinned them on his wall. Right next to the note he wrote the night he built Sentinel. "One day this will protect someone I'll never meet. That'll be enough." But Ezra knew something else too. The story wasn't over. For every airline that signed the charter, another tried to rewrite the rules quietly. For every apology aired, another child stayed silent in fear. So Sentinel kept watching. Ezra kept building, Violet kept protecting, and the sky, it started listening better. Tell us where you're watching from, and how this chapter made you feel. Have you ever witnessed injustice but didn't know how to speak up? Would you trust a system like Sentinel if it meant holding powerful people accountable? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and who knows, maybe Ezra's watching too. She wore gray slacks, orthopedic shoes, and a soft blue cardigan that looked like it had stories sewn into every thread. No one paid her much attention at first. Just another elderly woman boarding first class on Flight 1182 from Atlanta to San Francisco, until the flight attendant saw her ticket and frowned. "Ma'am, I think you're in the wrong seat." The woman looked up, calm. "No, this is 2A. It's on my boarding pass." The attendant forced a smile. "Right, but this is priority comfort seating. Are you sure you didn't mean 22A?" A few passengers nearby glanced over. Still calm, the woman replied, "I paid for 2A. I've flown this route every third Thursday for the last 4 years." The attendant leaned in, lowering her voice. "I'm just saying, this section has a certain standard, you know?" A pause, a shift in the air. The woman didn't argue. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver badge. No words, just a soft click as she laid it flat on the tray table. The attendant froze. Passengers leaned in, because on that badge were the words SkySure Passenger Ethics, Oversight Council. Founding member, what no one knew yet, was that her name was Mrs. Eunice Farrow. And she wasn't just a frequent flyer. She was one of the original architects of the Passenger Fairness Index, a core protocol used by Sentinel to assess bias in crew behavior. She'd spent 40 years in transportation law, helped write the original anti-discrimination codes for the Department of Aviation, and retired quietly after the system went digital. She had no social media, didn't do press, but she watched everything, especially flights. The attendant's voice cracked. I didn't mean to offend." Mrs. Farrow raised a hand gently. "I know what you meant." Then, almost kindly, "But what matters is what you did." 15 minutes later, mid-air, the pilot received a strange notification from the Sentinel interface built into their onboard management system. Crew member C127 has triggered a live ethics review. Passenger 2A is a Level 1 verified council authority. Recommendation: immediate compliance with Skyfair protocol. The co-pilot blinked. "I didn't even know it could do that." The captain glanced back toward the cabin. "You just don't mess with someone who writes the rule book." Meanwhile, in Chicago, Ezra got a ping. He didn't recognize the name, but the source was flagged. SkySure Legacy Tier Alert. When he opened the live report, he saw the footage, the words, the tone, the hesitation. He didn't need to interfere, because Sentinel had already sent the data to Airline Compliance Lead's FAA Ethics Division and the airline's in-house review board. The case was logged, public record time-stamped, and the attendant grounded before they even landed. Back in the cabin, Mrs. Farrow sat quietly sipping ginger tea, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but with the kind of peace that comes from knowing the system finally worked. She didn't yell, she didn't film, she just let the truth surface. When the plane landed, no one made a scene, but there was a quiet murmur, a ripple of respect. Someone whispered, "That's her, the SkySure lady." Another said, "She didn't say a word, she just let the badge speak." And someone else added, "Now that's first class." The airline issued a statement by evening. "We have the utmost respect for Mrs. Farrow's contributions to air travel fairness. The crew member involved has been placed on immediate leave pending further training." It didn't go viral. It didn't need to, because within 48 hours, 4 other airlines quietly updated their crew training manuals, and a new clause was added to the Sentinel system. All SkySure Council members shall be flagged with immunity override in behavior review logs. Ezra smiled when he saw it, not because someone got fired, but because someone finally didn't have to fight. He looked up at Violet. "People like her built the system so people like me wouldn't have to." Violet nodded. "And now you're protecting the ones who built it." Later that week, Mrs. Farrow received a letter in her mail, handwritten, from Ezra. "Thank you for building the road I now get to walk on. P.S. If you ever want to help with Sentinel 3.0, I saved a seat." She smiled, folded the letter, and quietly bought a ticket for Chicago. It didn't happen overnight, but when it did, it moved like a tide that had been building for years. No press release could soften it. No corporate statement could spin it. Because this time, the system turned inward. It began with a hearing. The FAA Ethics Subcommittee, backed by bipartisan pressure and public outrage, announced a full inquiry into racial bias and power abuse in airline service protocols. But this wasn't just another roundtable. This time, they called in data. Sentinel data. Thousands of ethically flagged incidents. Patterns across flight crews, routes, and airport terminals. Evidence of suppression tactics, false reassignment codes, and what Ezra had labeled invisible misconduct algorithms. The senators were stunned. And then came the final slide. A graph showing systemic bias not only existed, it was digitally embedded in the systems that ran everything from seat upgrades to flight crew reports. Silence filled the chamber. Then, Senator Rachel Holloway leaned forward and said, "So, a 9-year-old's ethics system sees what our entire oversight department missed for decades?" The FAA commissioner didn't blink. He replied, "Yes, and his system doesn't lie." Within 48 hours, the FAA did something unheard of. They issued a national compliance mandate. All U.S. commercial carriers must implement the Passenger Fairness Index, PFI, as part of their operational clearance, effective immediately. Non-compliance will result in suspension of flight certifications within U.S. airspace. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, followed 2 days later. They made the PFI an international certification requirement, meaning that if airlines wanted access to global airspace, they had to comply. In the span of 1 week, 3 major airline CEOs resigned. 146 flight routes were temporarily suspended. 19 airports demanded PFI dashboards be installed at boarding gates. And in press rooms around the world, headlines erupted. Ezra Thompson's Sentinel becomes international standard. Passenger Fairness Index reshapes global air travel. Child prodigy forces 92 airlines into ethics reform. But Ezra didn't care about the headlines. He was focused on the infrastructure, because systems, he'd learned, can be loud in their harm, but quiet in their repair. So he launched Sky Mirror, an open-source tool allowing passengers to review ethical ratings of crews, routes, and terminals before flying. And it wasn't just cosmetic. It included verified public audit history, real-time reporting tools, anonymous whistleblower vaults, AI transparency scores for every route. The slogan? Don't just book your seat, know what kind of sky you're flying into. Meanwhile, inside Sentinel's control server, something lit up. A full-page badge, labeled Compliance Achieved. 74% of global fleet now ethics integrated. Ezra stared at the number, then whispered, "We're getting there." Back in D.C., the Department of Transportation issued a rare public apology. In front of dozens of press outlets, the secretary stood behind a clear podium and said, "We failed to protect passengers who looked different, sounded different, or didn't fit into legacy molds. That ends now. The Passenger Fairness Index is no longer optional. It's foundational." Then he stepped aside and introduced Ezra. The boy stood quietly, blazer a little too big, eyes steady. He didn't bring a speech. He brought a scroll. He held it up and unrolled it. It read, "The Flight Justice Charter. Every passenger is a citizen of the sky. Every crew member is accountable to truth, not tradition. Every incident leaves a data trail. Every flight leaves a record, not just of distance, but of dignity." He didn't read it aloud. He just stepped back, and the entire room stood to their feet. By month's end, 118 airlines had signed the charter. A quiet ripple of change spread through training rooms, flight schools, and gate policy checklists. Even cabin crew manuals were rewritten. One slide now began every session. A passenger is not a seat number. A child is not a threat. You are not just crew. You are a guardian of dignity at 35,000 feet. At home, Violet watched it all unfold. She asked Ezra, "Do you realize what you've done?" He shook his head. "I didn't want to do anything big. I just didn't want to get slapped again without anyone caring." That night, planes flew quieter. Not in noise, but in intention. Cabin lights dimmed, doors shut, jetways retracted. But across the system, something new hovered in the data. Accountability. Passenger dignity wasn't just a tagline anymore. It was coded into the air itself. The invitation came in a white envelope. No gold seal. No fancy calligraphy. Just one line typed neatly across the top. "You are hereby nominated for the 2029 Nobel Peace Prize." Ezra stared at it. He didn't move, didn't smile. He just blinked. Across the room, Violet whispered, "Baby, that's real." But Ezra shook his head, slowly. "I didn't do this for peace. I did it because I was scared." Violet walked over and knelt in front of him. And that's exactly why it matters. 1 week later, Chicago O'Hare. Ezra stood at gate A27, the very gate where he was slapped 10 months ago. Same terminal, same carpet, same vending machine humming beside the window. But this time, it was different. There were news crews now, reporters, activists, airline execs, and people, hundreds of people. Not protesting, not shouting, just waiting. Not for Ezra's arrival, but for his flight. Flight 8801, inbound from Zurich. Final leg of the international charter tour, and on it, representatives from 41 airlines, 6 government agencies, and 3 global ethics boards. The last passenger off the plane? Mrs. Eunice Farrow. She stepped onto the jet bridge, flanked by 2 attendants who bowed slightly as she passed. She carried a briefcase. No press, no entourage, just a smile, and one handwritten letter, Ezra's. The crowd parted as she reached the podium next to him. No speeches, no script. Just a quiet moment between the woman who built the old system and the boy who rebuilt it better. She whispered, "This is your sky now." Ezra whispered back, "No, it's ours." Then she handed him the briefcase. Inside, the final draft of the International Passenger Fairness Accord, complete with 193 signatures. Every nation with an aviation system had agreed. The skies, once ruled by invisible bias and unchecked power, were now monitored by the code of a child. A reporter called out, "Ezra, do you have any final words for the public?" He stepped to the mic, looked down, then back up. "I don't want applause. I don't want revenge. I just want kids to fly without fear. And if you ever feel like you don't belong somewhere, don't change yourself. Change the rules." The crowd erupted in quiet, steady applause. Not loud, not frenzied, just full. Because the people in that terminal knew they weren't just clapping for a boy. They were clapping for every seat that had once been denied, every voice that had once been dismissed, every parent who'd held back tears because there was nowhere else to go at 30,000 feet. That night, Ezra's room. He sat alone. Laptop open, lines of code glowing softly. The Sentinel dashboard had gone quiet. No live violations, no critical alerts. For the first time since it launched, the map was blue, clear, clean, balanced. He whispered, "We did it." Then clicked one final button. "Lock protocol." A small message popped up. Sentinel core frozen. No edits, no overrides, no power grabs. He'd removed himself as the system's admin, because real justice, he believed, must live beyond the hands that created it. 2 months later, Nobel Peace Summit, Oslo. He stood beside human rights lawyers, climate activists, and educators. When his name was called, the auditorium went silent. The youngest nominee in history. But he declined the microphone. Instead, he handed the committee a small chip. On it, the full open-source Sentinel code, freely available to any nation or organization willing to build their own systems of fairness. He said only this: "I don't want to be remembered. I want the system to remember you." That same night, Global Transit Systems from India to Iceland downloaded the first Sentinel derivatives, not just for airlines, but for buses, trains, ferries, subways, even school transportation fleets, because fairness wasn't about altitude, it was about access. And Ezra had taught the world that code could carry more than data. It could carry dignity. Final scene. O'Hare. Gate A27, 1 year later. A child boards a plane with his mom. He's nervous, clutching his teddy bear. They sit in row 2A. A flight attendant walks by, smiles warmly, kneels, offers the boy a cookie. No fuss, no looks, no questions, just kindness. A nearby passenger notices a sticker on the crew's tablet. Sky Sure Verified. Passenger Ethics Score, A+. The mother breathes easier. The boy laughs. And the plane takes off. No fanfare. Just flight. Epilogue. Ezra never returned to the spotlight. He enrolled in a small school in Vermont, studied philosophy and systems engineering, spent weekends coding with other quiet kids who believed in rules that protected, not controlled. Sometimes, reporters asked where he'd gone. Others tried to track him down. But he stayed off the grid, not to hide, but because he'd already said everything he needed to say. Through Sentinel, through his silence, through a single moment at 35,000 feet, when he refused to move for anyone's comfort but stood still for everyone's future. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us this: would you have done what Ezra did? Have you ever wanted to fix a system that didn't believe you? What if the next Sentinel is written by your child? Drop your thoughts below, because your stories matter too.